It is my great pleasure and honor to introduce our keynote speaker today and to enter into a conversation with him. President Derek Johnson from the NAACP. He has dedicated his career to advancing in the service of civil rights and creating a more equitable and just society. And we're honored to have him help us set the stage for our conversations today on these topics and how they interrelate with climate impacts and climate justice. So, President Johnson, we are here as part of Climate Week, but as we have these conversations, we are really working to center equity and justice into all of them. And I know the NAACP has done a lot of work on these topics of climate justice and environmental justice, so I wanted to kick us off, if you might mind sharing how you all think about these topics and some of the sort of key work that you're doing on them now.
Great. Thank you for allowing me to be here. And to everyone here, I just got off a red eye from San Francisco that was diverted to Baltimore, who, when I woke up, thought I was in New York and spent 2 hours, and then I got here, only get into traffic for an hour and a half to get here. So if I sound punch drunk, I am. So we're a civil rights organization, 113 years old, started in 1909. And so we have grown as a result of the current reality. Our largest department is actually climate justice. And the reason why is because if there's no planet, there's no need to advocate for voting rights, education, so on and so on. And we recognize that the issues around climate justice within itself have levels of inequity. Because many of the pollutants that you find dumped in communities are adjacent to African American or Latino or poor white communities. You'll find that the air quality in many of these communities has caused a high percentage disproportionately of individuals with asthma. I grew up with asthma, grew up in Detroit in the backdrop of the auto industry. And you'll find aging infrastructures, particularly water infrastructures, not being serviced properly, i.e. Flint, Michigan and the water crisis, which is a whole fight that was several decades around the control of the Detroit Water Department. And then, as a result of that, of the government at the time, they did some things to starve Detroit of revenue, and they switched to the Flint River to get the water from Flint, as opposed to pumping it from Detroit. And everyone knew that the Flint River had long been polluted by some of the original auto plants from the 30s. And as a result of that, the water coming through the pipes was so corrosive it exposed some of the coating and allowed lead to seep into the piping. And what's unfortunate about Flint, lead is still in the water. I live in the city of Jackson. You all have seen recently in the news about the water issue in Jackson. It is a climate problem. Why? Because it was the flood that had really exposed the problem with the water system in Jackson. And in Baltimore, they're still under a boil water alert because of pollutants in the water. So when you think about climate justice, for us, we have to think about the lived experience of African Americans and other communities who are directly impacted and the issues around health that result from that. And so climate justice is personal, is real, is present, and it's something that must be addressed. Now, climate opportunity is a great place to invest. Because living off of the fossil fuel economy is the old economics. The new economics really is what are the technologies and things that can be put in place to generate shareholder value and yet have a planet where shareholders can actually exist. Because if there's no planet, there are no shareholders. But if we protect the planet, and we can do so with a value proposition, it really is a do well and do good opportunity for all of us.
Absolutely, and I'd love to hear your thoughts more on what this does mean for investors or could mean for investors. There are certainly the opportunities, and I think a lot of the investors in the room and in our network, which are mostly endowment and foundation decision makers and their service providers, so investment consultants and managers, want to ensure that as they're looking to invest in climate solutions that they're doing so with a lens to justice and not having unintended consequences as we kind of drive this transition. So what would you want these investors to be thinking about as they're sort of approaching that? I think particularly a lot of, as you mentioned, some of these issues are place-based, not community-based. I don't know if you have thoughts on how investors can really tap into that to ensure that the investments they're making are having the impacts they want them to.
So in 2018, I was reading an article about Germany. Germany had, at that point, was able to sustain its grid for more than 2 or 3 days off of renewable energy. I was like, wow, that's fascinating, because what we hear in the US that is not possible and how all these barriers exist. And then I began to think, what would happen if we identify the necessary technologies to do the same here? And so as an association, we started looking for models that we could highlight. And one of the things we began to look at is the concept of the Living Building Challenge. So we went out to Seattle. Build Foundation had this living building. At that time, I think it was only 19 of them. They were negative zero carbon footprint. They were actually generating revenue. They would take the brown water, recycle it, and water the plants. They would use all of the technologies. In order for this building to be constructed, this is opportunities around new technologies. Hempcrete is stronger than concrete, and there's opportunity now to start looking at how do we invest in industrial hemp as opposed to fossil fuel, because industrial hemp within itself is a carbon vacuum. It pulls the carbon out of the air, and there has been enough research to show that hempcrete is one of the things that could actually reverse what's taking place as opposed to concrete, which is really a problem. Begin to look at the construction of manufacturing opportunities around solar as solar began to advance in its technology, and battery storage as it begins to advance its technology. And there's so many other things that should be considered outside of what the norm now. I said earlier, I grew up in Detroit. We don't have a subway system because the automotive industry fought against any public policy to put taxes to build out infrastructure. I went to law school in Houston. They don't have a subway system, and Lord knows they need some public transportation in Houston. If you've ever been to Houston, that traffic. But the oil industry did everything they could to block any type of mass public transportation. The investment community, particularly the institutional investors, pension funds, and things of that nature, you all have the ability to go up against these major concerns who want to keep the status quo because of their profit margin or those put on the planet. The responsibility in this room, or the opportunity in this room, is bar none the strongest in this sector. Because as institutional investors, you have the power to tell BP or Mobil, one of like, no, we're going in a different direction. You have the power to tell Ford Motor Company or GM, say, no, let's consider something different. You have the power to really set a new standard so that public policy can really adjust itself in ways in which we can do good for the planet, do good by society, and again, create wealth for your shareholders, which oftentimes is the general public. Because the pensioners are people who work every day. It's the bus drivers, it's the, you name, go down that litany. That's who we're protecting. So now, not only you maximize shareholder value, you're protecting your shareholders' quality of life.
It's a great point, and that kind of shareholder engagement directly with the companies, I think, is a huge leverage point for who are the owners of these companies, really. So I'm curious your thoughts on, as we have this transition happen, there's going to be a lot of changes, there's going to be some downsides, but there's going to be a lot of upsides in terms of wealth creation and jobs. What are your thoughts, and what would you share with this audience around how to ensure that those opportunities are shared more equitably?
I recall during President Obama's tenure, and everyone's talking about the new green economy, and I've been waiting for this new green economy. I've just been searching for it. In theory, it is correct, because the need to retrain and retool workers is a great opportunity. One of the things that we have done horribly with our education system, we have sought ways to do everything except train young people for the workforce of the future. And if we can begin to think about what is the training for the workforce of the future, the concept of an electrician shifts. It really becomes how do we retool all of these buildings and our infrastructure to ensure that we have a new green economy. That within itself is a business opportunity. And so as we look at the future, I was a part of a delegation that went to Germany. I don't know why I like Germany all of a sudden. We went to Germany. And we were looking at treatments of workers comparing to the German companies that was locating in the South. You have a lot of German companies locating in Alabama, for example. And we took a delegation over because the German model in relation with workers is completely different than the model in relation to workers here. So we have this contentious relationship between organized labor and corporations. But in Germany, the work council, that's their labor union, and they're invited to be at the table, and as decisions are being made, because they understand that the company's ability to generate effective, efficient efficiencies and really good products is through the partnership with the workers. So the work councils sit at the table, although it's organized labor. And out of that, they have designed a system, depending on what part of the country you live in, where from 8th grade all the way through, you begin to identify skill sets and interests, and young people go from, just learning basic, math and English or German to being trained to be engineers or work in a manufacturing plant or chemists or whatever the case may be. And they decide all the way through high school whether or not they want to just work in the manufacturing industry or get higher education and come back and support the manufacturing industry. They're really building out a workforce for the future. It is not this contentious relationship. Because if you look at all sides of it, there's no industry that can survive without workers, and there are no workers who can make a living without industry. So at some point, there has to be this mutual understanding of what the future should look like and how we all come to the table in a way that's different than the contentious way we've been operated in this country.
It's a great point, and it's a really interesting dynamic with our network too, because institutions of higher education often have endowments where they're looking at this from the investor perspective, but are also educating and training workers. And we've actually seen some examples of venture capital firms that are investing in companies that need new workforces, partnering with community colleges to help train those workforces for these new jobs. So there's a pretty interesting ecosystem, I think, within this network. So our time is short, and we do want to make this as interactive as possible. So I'm going to ask President Johnson one more question, and then we are going to turn it to audience questions. So, well, my last question is short, and I understand the NAACP has sort of gotten into the investment space a bit as well. We've got the folks from Impact Shares who have an ETF that you've developed in partnership with them. And I understand there's another sort of venture capital model that you all are thinking about. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Absolutely. So for many, many years in ACP, we would do industry reports. And they were great if the companies replied. And as soon as we did the report, it was stale. So our first foot into the area to try to shift that is develop an ETF. And with much fanfare, we launched it went off, but we didn't know what we didn't know. And in our index, we had fossil fuels. And so many institutional investors, particularly foundations, says, we want to put money into it, however, you have fossil fuel. And for us, we was like, well, we hadn't thought about it because we had clear value propositions around the environment and climate, but we had not considered investment on the ETF. So we've since removed the fossil fuel out of there, and it is going. And spending a lot of time on the West Coast, we also recognize that the emerging economy around technology was moving at a rapid pace. And you think about the companies like Facebook and Twitter, they're barely 20 years old. And they're dominating so much. I was speaking to an executive at Comcast, and I asked a question, because they're trying to figure out their market share and what's taking place right after FedEx had announced their loss. And I said, when are you all going to recognize that Amazon is like eating your lunch, and whether it's FedEx or it's Target or Walmart or Comcast come together to figure out how you're going to combat that, because at the end of the day, Amazon is going to buy all of them up. Right now I have a choice between Whole Food Amazon and Kroger. Really soon it's going to be a choice between Whole Food Amazon and Kroger Amazon, because that's the pace in which we're going. And so as we begin to look at that, we say, we have to be in this space because many people are being left out in middle America. much of the tech innovation and investment is on the coastlines. And so we began to talk to Mitch and Frida Kapoor about how they see things. And out of those conversations, we've decided to launch a venture capital fund to be a VC of VCs. Looking at the current landscape, many African Americans are unable to raise over $50 million, which is a rounding error in terms of VC funds. But we're feeling that with our brand identity and partnering with the Kapoor Center, we could create a new reality so that VC fund investors who are in Middle America can identify some innovations from some young talented individuals and provide that seed investment to move forward. That's the role of the NACP. We're an advocacy group, but we also understand that we must set models and best practices to advance what we're advocating for. And then finally, if we don't do it now, this market space is going to morph everything else we could consider. Because there's so much money on the West Coast. It's amazing. The center of gravity for finance is New York. Center of gravity for manufacturing was in Detroit. Now the center of gravity for fossil fuel was in Texas. Now the real money is in Silicon Valley. And if we don't have enough African Americans who are actively in that space or understand how that world works, we will only further the divide between the haves and have-nots.
Excellent. Well, thank you. And so, do we have some questions from the audience?
Thank you. Let me take this off. First of all, it's great to see the intersection of NAACP and inclusion and IEN and what we're doing here. So glad to be here. The NAACP, I was a member of the NAACP Trade Council back in the 90s when Earl Shinhoster, Fred Rashid, and we had the Fair Share program. And Kroger actually was a signatory there. Part of that Fair Share program was 75 companies said they're going to put more blacks on their board of directors. So in shareholder engagement here, we talk about putting diverse candidates on boards of directors. NAACP was doing it 40 years ago. So I'd like you to just comment on the importance of putting black people on boards of directors, and black and ESG. You can't have just black people, you have to have black people who are enlightened as well. So we want more ESG advocates there as well. On the board, and what do you think the NAACP can do in partnership with IEN to promote that effort? I have a dozen other questions, but I'm not going to bring those up for you. And one last thing. How many of y'all are members of NAACP? Yes, many people say, nobody asked me. So I just asked, and Derek could tell you how to do it. And so you can't say nobody asked you. So you've been asked. President Johnson.
Thank you. It's interesting you mentioned Earl Shinhouse. Earl Shinhouse, regional director, was one of the people that really inspired me to get involved. So, and Fred Rashid for that matter. Diversity within corporations' decision-making chain up and down the ladder becomes even more crucial when you consider how to grow a market. There's a company, and I can't say which one, I'm under NDA. They had horrific problems. We began to discuss, well, what should change? And they appointed some members to the board. They had 2 people in the C-suite now. And the racialized tension they had kind of began to weaken, but their profit margin began to grow. Why? Because they opened up a market. They had people sitting at the tables who knew the nuances of, well, you may not want to place the paper on this side of the arm because it means this to this community. Put it on this arm. If you put it on this arm, they can see themselves as a part of your customer base. Well, you take, fashion houses. We have a really, really good relationship with Gucci. Gucci had a serious problem. Now, I'm not fancy like Gucci. But Gucci immediately realized that how one portrays image really defines how people treat them. And so immediately after multiple conversations, Gucci had invested tremendously in young creatives in the African American community, partnering with high schools. But they didn't stop there. They began to hire people in decision-making positions. But they didn't stop there. They began to really drill down on how they are projecting their images and the inclusiveness of their images. Or P&G. If you look at a P&G commercial, you would, and it was 20 years ago, you'd be shocked. You have same-sex loving couples, you have mixed couples, you have all of the stereotypical breakthroughs that 20 years ago none of us would have thought would have been imagined. But there was an intentional effort by P&G before George Floyd, only accelerated after George Floyd, because they are a global company and they understand the market space. But that also happened because there were some individuals with decision-making authority sitting in the right seats to say, we need to change what we do because we're leaving too much on the table. McKinsey did a report about the entertainment industry, leaving $10 billion on the table because of the lack of diversity in decision-making positions. It is beyond asinine not to ensure that there's board diversity, C-suite diversity, management diversity. It is not a zero-sum game. It is not if you put these people here, it's going to take away from there. No, it's actually opening up your market and opportunities. And as institutional investors, that should be one of the demands. Because you can't return profits for your institutions if you have a myopic view leadership running in the companies that you're invested in. So the Share Fair program was a part of that, but now we want to do Share Fair on steroids.
Fantastic. Do we have time for another question or two? One more?
I do have a question around climate and what is the NAACP's position around participation in the Inflation Reduction Act, since this is a transformative piece of legislation, and how do you view inclusion in that legislation?
So we were deeply engaged in some of the language in the Act. We absolutely push for inclusion. That's who we are as an organization. Just yesterday, we had a member of our staff testifying before the Committee on Homeland Security around the water infrastructure crisis using Jackson and Flint as model examples. Much of what we're seeing around infrastructure power grabs is racialized, that when states no longer see a local community that's looking like them, they go in to seize the assets and try to privatize it or regionalize it. The Inclusion Act, the Inflation Act, we want to use many of the tenets there, and in the infrastructure bill, Justice 40, to prevent that from happening. What we see in Jackson right now is the state's efforts over 3 decades to starve the system of resources because the water money from EPA comes to the state and then the state reallocate. A state like Mississippi or Alabama, they don't have the wherewithal to support water system. It's all federal money. But states like Mississippi, Alabama, South Carolina, they depend on federal government. In fact, they depend on federal taxes collected in New York to further their white supremacist public policy. Because for $1 cent from the state of Mississippi, we receive between $9 and $12 back depending on the year in federal funds. And so all of those things combined, when we have big policy like the Inflation Reduction Act or the infrastructure bill, that we are zeroing in on how can we language it in ways in which there are more inclusion, that you eliminate the power grabbing of assets and you ensure a higher quality performance.
I'm worried about the war on ESG, and to the extent the racial equity and climate justice and all these things get lumped together, there's a concerted effort on the part of the Business Roundtable, the Chamber, as well as a number of other groups to completely disembody and disempower shareholders in these funds. Has the NAACP been watching this, and what do you suggest we start doing?
So ESG emerged out of nowhere one day. I woke up one morning, everyone said ESG, ESG. But the definition of it varies wildly. Just recently, our Hollywood office asked all of the studios for their definition of ESG. Only 2 of them responded, and their response was completely different. I suspect if you do that to broader corporate America, you'll get the same. At some point, institutional investors like in this room who care about it and in ACP, we must define what it is. with benchmarks and metrics. Because otherwise, it's the buzzword of the next couple of months before a new concept is going to come out of nowhere. Because the concept of ESG, I guess someone wrote a paper one day and everybody said, well, we're going to have ESG. When I'm talking to a company and they talk about this is our diversity and inclusion officer, I always ask and say, who does that person report to? And do they actually have a P&L sheet? If they don't have a profit and loss sheet, they have no authority. Then you're window dressing and I need to talk to someone else. Not that the person is a bad person, but we don't have time for the window dressing. And even with ESG, one particular banking institution, we will go to these quarterly meetings and they always talk about the E and the G and the messy middle. And I said, what do you mean? What are you talking about? Either you're for equity and inclusion or you're not. Either you're going to make sure you put metrics in place for these big dollar commitments that you're making, or what I see is every time there is a crisis, you roll out this big announcement, you never use the money for the purpose, and then you pull the money back for the next crisis so you can roll out a big announcement again. And that's most of them. If we take a look at the commitments after George Floyd, we will find that less than 30%, I think less than 20% actually honored the commitments. There are 4 companies that we've been back and forth with, and they make these big commitments, and the goalposts keep moving. So at some point, we must clearly define what is ESG. And if we don't want to use ESG as the moniker, let's figure out what it is, and clearly define it, and put real metrics behind it, because we're only going to get what we measure. And if there are no metrics behind it, it's going to be fuzzy buzzwords and a lot of conferences talking about it, and no one really knows what it is.
Hear, hear. So, unfortunately, I think that is all the time we have. But President Johnson, thank you again so much for braving the tough travels and joining us here today, for sharing your insights. And we really do hope and look forward to working with the NAACP to help advance our common mission and to help more institutional investors get behind this work. So please join me in thanking President Johnson. Thank you.